Buenos días a todos. Muchísimas gracias a la...
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much to the Gipuzkoa Provincial Council for inviting me. I'm not going to dance, so don't worry. But I'd also like to thank the Gipuzkoa Provincial Council for coming up with this wonderful initiative, Etorkizuna, Eraikiz. It's a wonderful initiative, and I'm delighted to be here at this conference because the two pillars of this initiative are to listen and to experiment. And I think at the heart of this is the recognition that there are a lot of problems in the world. Globalization, climate change, inequality, the rise of populism, the crisis of democracy. But in public institutions and in government, we alone can't come up with responses. We need to work with all of you. And I think this is what Etorkizuna Eraikiz recognizes and aims to solve. It's an exercise in humility carried out by public institutions. But today, I'm going to talk about governance. And I'm just going to give you a bird's eye view of different international experiences based on governance. And this is a wonderful, if you look from a bird's eye view, you see all sorts of things. You know, you see the roads, you see the mountains. It's great. But from this high up, we can't distinguish a bus from a car. So we have to simplify. So, I mean, it has its pros, it has its drawbacks as well. So we're going to give a very general overview. It will be a simplified overview, but it does have its usefulness because it gives you a general idea of what public institutions and the world of governance, where it's going and what it's doing now in the 21st century. And we'll also have a quick look at the past and see the evolution of the different administrations. So what are we seeing today? Well, we're seeing a conflict, a clash between the Leviathan against COVID-19. This is the clash that we're seeing at the moment. And in fact, for the first time in many, many years, states, governments, administrations are actually approaching social, economic and health in a different way, a way that we haven't seen since the Second World War. And in fact, we've been privatizing markets in the past, but in fact this tendency and this trend is now changing. Public authorities now have actually taken center stage once again. And I think that the Leviathan will end up beating the virus, but there is a price to be paid. The first price is economic in nature. We are seeing a moment in which public debt, national debt, is as higher than it's ever been. You can see. I've given you an example here of the US, the federal debt. And there you can see the Great Recession, the Great Depression. After that, you can see it always rises, but it's nothing like what is happening now. And we will have to pay this debt directly or indirectly, but it will need to be paid back. And this is going to be one of the challenges faced by governance in the coming decades. And if we have a look at Europe, we see that the different European countries also, now we can see their evolution during the 20th century. The UK, France, Netherlands, Italy, you can see that the debt rises in times of war. And then we're seeing now that after the pandemic, it is growing once again. The lines are going up to limits that I don't know if they are or not sustainable, but they're definitely going to be exercising pressure on public budgets. It's true that we're getting the next generation funds, and thanks to that, we will be okay, but there will be restrictions. So what do we need? What do we need to get out of this situation? The pandemic added to all the problems that we had before. Globalization, outsourcing, deindustrialization, incredible increase in inequalities, differences, socio-economic differences that are very, very high between the rich and the poor, and then obviously the populist movements. And in fact, this is, it's an uprising. It's an uprising of the regions that have been left out, the deindustrialized regions in the UK, the Midlands, for example, in the US, with Chicago. There's an uprising, and they are clashing with the great metropolis, for example, the City of London in the UK. In France, we're seeing something similar in Italy, in France, in Thailand, in Brazil. There's an uprising of regions who are rising up against the capital cities because they feel that they're isolated from governance. What do we need? Governance, proper governance. Now, I was looking for different definitions of governance, and it's sometimes difficult to find an exact definition. I found lots of definitions for governance, so a way of managing a country or an entity, searching for economic and social progress. Other people say that it's processes of interaction between different stakeholders in terms of or in relation to a public issue. But I think there are a couple of things, 2 or 3 key elements that really define governance. 2, I think, in general. And I think that Etorkizuna like Eraikiz really reflects these 2 elements that are so important when we're talking about governance. What is governance at the end of the day? What would be my equation? Well, democratic quality and the quality in public decision making. So citizens, through whatever mechanism, need to feel that they are participating, that they are involved in the same way, on an equal footing. And it's true that there are some citizens who participate more than others. There are certain economic interests that are involved. But then there's something else as well here, which is the quality of governance or the quality of government. Perhaps here in Spain we could talk about quality of the administration, because we often tend to talk about the administrations here in Spain. But we're talking about the quality of government, the quality with which policies are implemented. And I think both of these things together make up governance. And we need to really pay attention to both of these different aspects, and there are opportunities and threats involved with both. Let's have a look first at democratic quality. It is important, first of all. Now, that might seem that I'm stating the obvious, because we all like democracy, we're all in favour of freedom, but it's important to make sure that democracy and freedom actually has a positive effect on citizens' well-being. And this is now under debate, because there are still many people who think, well, if you're poor, and you live in a poor country, then maybe a benevolent, less democratic government would be better. I mean, there is a debate going on at the moment. And until very recently, there's evidence, or up until recently there were evidence saying that greater participation gave rise to greater well-being. But in fact, more recently, other factors have come into play. For example, the natural resources available to a country, democracy will add an extra to economic development, the quality of life, life expectancy. So it is important. Now, we've just had a pandemic, and I would also say that that democracy actually cures, because at the beginning of the pandemic, people were saying that maybe more autocratic governance were actually going to be much better at handling the pandemic. Look at what happens, for example, in China. They're much better because they don't have to go through all these long processes of, getting everybody on board. And there were some graphs there that, and here we can see the deaths per million, or in millions of people since the beginning of the century, since the 1960s. And this correlates, obviously, with the wealth of the country, the GDP per person, per capita. However, what we can see is that democracy is important, because in non-democracies, more people die than in democratic countries, despite what was said at the beginning of the pandemic, that non-democratic countries were going to do much more to stop the virus because they didn't have to actually have everybody on board. They could just act more quickly. And that might have been true at the very, very beginning. But in the long term, when democracies act, they might act more slowly, but it's much more effective what they do. And they also, democracies it's not that they know more, it's just that they learn more than dictatorships. They're willing to learn from their neighbours, they learn from their own mistakes as well. And before the pandemic, democracy was actually in decline all over the world. Now, this is something that is very concerning. Here we can see from 2009, from the financial crisis, we can see all over the world there's an increase. I've just invented this word, by the way, and I think we ought to actually add it to the dictionary. I call it the autocratization. And there's autocratization surges all over the world. If we have a look at the figures there, it is very, very concerning. And if we look on the right-hand side, we can see the share of the world population living in autocratizing countries, so countries who are becoming more autocratic, has increased from 2009 to 2019, from 6% to 34%. Hungary, Poland, I mean, there are many, many examples. So before the pandemic in 2009, only 6% of the population were undergoing this process. But now, after the pandemic, this has gone up to 34%. This is very concerning. Another concerning piece of data is that if we have a look at liberal democracy indexes, which have been created by the Biden Institute, and they measure, they have a democratic scale, and they measure the quality of democracy in different countries on a sliding scale, and they award a score. Here we can see Sweden right at the top, there at the top, and all the Scandinavian countries are always up there at the top. But it measures the integration, the inclusivity of democracy in different countries, whether they're freer, not freer, whether there's the bias towards the government in the media, for example, if they're inclusive. So they measure on a number of different variables the quality of democracy. I mean, between Yemen right at the bottom and Sweden right at the top, there's a huge difference. And here, I've shown you all the different countries in accordance with their position. Above the line, you can see the countries in which there is now more democracy than back in 2009. So I'm showing you both the position of the countries and also a comparison with what it was in the comparison between their position in 2009 and 2019. Above the line are countries in which there is more democracy. And what we're seeing here is that there is a strong trend towards autocratization. Spain has sunk a little bit. Bulgaria, Romania. In fact, most countries, we can see, have lost a certain level of quality in their democracy. They're still democratic regimes, but they've lost quality of democracy over the last 10 years or so. And I think that this is a trend that may have been accelerated by the pandemic. Another concerning piece of data is that this isn't so much a snapshot of the current time. This is more of a long-term, longitudinal study of the evolution of democracies and autocratic regimes over the last century. Also, in dark blue, we can see countries that are in processes of democratization, so that civil liberties are increasing, citizens are more and more free, they're more competitive, more political parties exist. There are fewer citizens who are at the margin of the decision-making process. There's universal suffrage for both men and women. And what we can see is that there's been an increase, or there was an increase in democratization at the beginning of the century, especially after the First World War. After the Second World War, after 1945, there was again another increase. And then finally, in the 1970s, starting in Latin America, and then following on with the countries in Eastern Europe, many countries were in processes of democratization. This has fallen. Obviously, there are fewer countries who are becoming democracies because there are more democracies. But what's important here is to look at the evolution of the light blue line at the bottom, which measures countries which are in process of autocratization. And you can see that there are now many countries. There are fewer, obviously, in comparison to the countries that are going through processes of democratization. But you can see that there is a second, you can see in grey, you can see this is where there's been an increase. And there's a second grey column, moment of darkness, just after 1960. But then finally, we can see that since the end of the last century, and especially the beginning of this century, we can see that the beginning of the third wave of autocratization. There are more and more countries who are moving towards more autocratic regimes. And now, after the pandemic, we actually, for the first time ever, we have more countries in processes of autocratization than in processes of democratization. Is this concerning? Yes. If we look back, we can see that in the 1990s, non-free countries accounted for 12% of the worldwide GDP. I mean, this was a very small figure, but now, thanks to other countries like China and other autocratic regimes, they actually account for 33% of the worldwide GDP. Now, this is concerning, to say the least, and should lead us to ask, are we not actually on the verge of starting with a wave of dictatorships? Maybe this is what we are seeing. I know that Putin once said that the era of democracy was over. And I don't think it is that's what's going to happen, because dictators or dictatorships don't have Dallas, basically. This is what I say. They don't have a series like Dallas. I'll explain what I'm going to explain that now. Now, the straw that broke the camel's back of dictatorial regimes in Eastern Europe, what broke the camel's back was the fact that people actually had access to television and they could see series. They could watch series such as Dallas, which showed this incredibly capitalist way of life, and they kind of worked out what it was that they could have. And seeing how other people and people who lived in democracies, how they lived, that was what actually put paid to dictatorships. I mean, they had structural problems as well, of course, but it was the straw that broke the camel's back. And so this is the importance of culture, again. For a political model to change, it really needs to captivate and win over the hearts and souls and dreams of citizens. And at the moment, dictatorships and authoritarian regimes, such as China, I mean, they have a certain degree of intellectual respectability, but they haven't actually been able to provide citizens with an alternative model that's going to seduce the young people. And obviously the problem we have in the Western world is the disaffection of young people with democratic systems. They're very happy, they're very satisfied, but they want something else, they want something more. And dictators and dictatorships still don't have their own Dallas to offer their citizens. So I think that we can safely say that the dictatorship era is really not going to happen now.
But we can't stop looking at the problems. I say there's a certain fatigue of intangible values in democracy. For instance, in Spain, fine, we have democratic elections, everything is clean and transparent, and votes are counted fast. That works, but there's that exhaustion, that fatigue of democracy. And in the US, this started in the US, this trend, and it is now very much present in Europe, mostly in the youth. The younger generations don't feel close and engaged to the regime, to the model, and they don't seem to be capable at the moment of imagining something that would be better. I would say the most serious problem we've witnessed recently is the greater polarization where political parties in the recent past, for instance, in the US, Democrats and whoever was in the opposition would reach agreements with the party in power. Well, not anymore. There seems to be some kind of a barrier, a hurdle They don't want to negotiate with the enemy. That's very much the situation now. There are ways to measure all of this, and one of those ways is what we can see up here on the screen for 4 different countries. Sweden seems to show us the way, at least for those who live in Sweden. I don't know if they would agree. To see how intangible values in society have suffered this and deteriorated. We can see in Italy, in blue, or rather purple. We can see in Spain as well how since the financial crisis and a little bit more recently how there's this unrest, this unhappiness with the government. We could also say something about the media. Are the media polarized as well? Well, there are studies that show that the audiences more and more are following, whether it is newspapers, radio programs, television channels that are on the extremes, polarization again. Are the media neutral? Are they unbiased? Well, less and less so by the looks of things. We can see here 4 countries where in this particular case the perception that there is a bias in the media is worse out of those 4 countries up on the screen. So again, more loss of quality and value of intangible values. Well, all of those ingredients were there in the recipe before the pandemic. And in this study by Francesc Amat and colleagues, citizens were interviewed and asked how far they would be prepared to sacrifice individual liberties or give powers to a strong leader, or unite around strong leadership. And they were asked that question for 3 different situations. In the case of a pandemic like COVID-19, for climate change, to combat climate change, or connected with terrorism. And look at that. Citizens said they were more prepared and more willing to sacrifice their individual liberties. In the case of COVID, is that an authoritarian chip activated in citizens in that case then? I do wonder. So let's now talk a little bit about a quality of government, which has nothing to do with amount or quantity. If we look at fiscal matters, is that what we mean? Is it the amount of government that we're measuring? Is it quantity? It's not, it's quality. Evidence proves that countries should first have good quality governments and then decide if they want to go for a model like Singapore or New Zealand or like Denmark with, shall we say, a powerful government or a beefy government. And that's the way if we want to avoid corruption. So what do we mean by quality of government? There are so many different possible definitions, but I think a good consensus would be the capacity and ability to provide services and design policies, public services and policies, which are unbiased, efficient, and corruption-free. So how are we doing as far as this quality of government is concerned? We need to measure that through indicators, there are many proposals for indicators, which unfortunately are all based on subjective perceptions. We don't have a quality meter just yet that can measure what citizens at large or entrepreneurs or employers or whoever feels about the way services are provided, public services are provided, for instance. Why do we need indicators? Well, because they need to first and foremost be well correlated, whoever designs them, whether it's a private company, a public institution, and evidence finds that time and time again, it's the same countries or the same regions, in the case of Europe, that appear as ranking first or amongst the first, no matter how you measure it. So perceptions seem to matter, and it does matter. For instance, if citizens in the Basque Country have a very positive perception of healthcare services here, is that important? Well, not really, because if they have that perception, then citizens here will decide if they want to stay here, if they want to pay taxes here or go elsewhere to set up their company. So perceptions are relevant, and that's why we need to take them into account. Let's have a look now at the last round of results by the European Quality of Government Index, commissioned by DG Regio in the EU, and the University of Gothenburg. Citizens were asked on how far public services that were provided were unbiased, good quality, if there was no corruption in different sectors, whether it's healthcare, education, the police, whatever. That's the EQI index. All of this with all statistical measures to avoid unnecessary bias. For instance, outliers, regions where citizens are giving very, very different results. So this is a little bit, some people might say, of a grotesque simplification of reality, but it actually works, and it correlates very, very well with many other indicators for quality and well-being. In blue, here we see regions that are above the average of the European Union, and in red, or shades of red, they're below. The darker the blue, the higher the score, and the lighter the red, the worse the score. We can see a clear difference between Eastern and Western Europe. Former communist countries seem to still be paying their debt, shall we say, of living under an authoritarian regime. And then there's also a clear difference between Northern Europe and Southern Europe. But one more important point is that when we look at the quality of government, our member state passport seems to matter less than your region. And not just in Spain, where government is very much decentralized, but in other countries too, like Italy. In theory, is the state government that provides the same services to all of their citizens in their different regions, but it's not working, right? Quality of government seems to be very much connected with how citizens connect and engage with authority. For instance, the Carabinieri police, for instance, in Italy. Well, there's a very different perception depending on where you live in Italy. So, differences amongst countries and within countries then. Here we can see the highest average and lowest average, Bulgaria and Finland. And then look at Germany. It's a very large country, but in that case, the quality of government seems to be fairly similar for the different Länder. Not the case for other countries, like we saw on the map, particularly in the case of Spain and Italy, in fact, in the European Union. The perception of quality of government is very different depending on the region. Later on, we'll see a little bit more detail about that. Since we started with this study back in 2010, which is still ongoing, I don't want you to focus on the names of the regions yet, but look how the outcomes now are more scattered, shall we say. There are greater differences. The gap has grown between regions where perception of quality of government is better or worse. Well, the Basque country is well above throughout the time series, even more so recently, well above the Spanish average and the European Union average. Spain is doing a little bit worse at the moment. The quality of government perception has worsened recently in Spain. And this is a more dramatic graph. Here we can see the percentiles for the different Spanish regions. Catalonia is just above 25%. That's a very low score. And we know that the situation in Catalonia is very particular at the moment. There are reasons connected with all the unrest connected with the will for independence. But again, I think this is very interesting, and this is why we're studying this particular point, because it matters. It has consequences. Well, it has causes too. The perception for better government tends to go hand in hand with a healthy economy, not in the case of Catalonia or in the case of some regions in Belgium too, where the economy is going quite well, but not the perception of quality of government. And yet causes also go the other way. There's feedback in that process. A better perception for the quality of government seems to be also the cause, in some regions in particular, for better performance in different factors. Different indicators for well-being, for instance, growth, social welfare, doing better with environmental matters, life expectancy, and also citizens who are more satisfied with life. Studies on happiness are more and more being included when quality of government is measured, and you might wonder why. Well, because feeling like we are part of our community makes us happier. Feeling that there's somebody who has a higher status in our community causes a lot of frustration in countries, for instance, like Iraq or Afghanistan. We know there's this reason for people to sometimes join, for instance, a jihadist group. So let's look at this graph now. Thinking about the regional level of the Human Development Index for wealth, education, and health. Well, there's a very high correlation with the index on quality of government. You can see how the clustering of certain countries are very, very close to the line. That means that the quality of government perception and the Human Development Index go together in those cases. What about the Basque country? Well, there's the perception that there's a high quality of government providing good public services, and that might be one of the reasons. Also, it might correlate with you having a much lower unemployment rate, for instance. We have cases like Estonia or other countries where there's very little perception of liberal values. For instance, gay marriage. Well, there's a correlation of 0.67 we found between liberal values and the perception of quality of government. Now, this is the $1 million question. How can we improve the quality of government? We've been talking about cultural values, the sense of community, peaceful coexistence, being open-minded. There are many cultural values that matter. And yet, when we study that empirically, for instance, comparing values in a Catholic country or a Protestant country, there have been studies that have compared and tried to check if that has an impact on the economy or whatever. I'm going to now present 4 elements that are questioned, even though we have quite a lot of empirical evidence to prove they do matter for quality of government. Meritocracy, for instance, to avoid a lack of equality in a society. What do we mean by meritocracy? Well, if somebody wants to become a civil servant, for instance, in a particular country, what matters most? Your performance and your talent, or your political connections. Well, we find that meritocracy does correlate spectacularly well with the quality of government perception. We can see that on this graph. Look at the situation there in Venezuela, where Hugo Chavez one morning, all of a sudden woke up one morning and sacked 20,000 civil servants. Well, look at the situation of Spain. It's fairly low, right? Probably because of the perception of the judiciary in some regions in particular, compared to Finland, for instance, where meritocracy is rated much higher, and somebody can become a minister, for instance, on the basis of their merits, and that's very much correlates with the way public services are rendered, or perceived at least. The same thing can be said about the correlation between meritocracy and the control and efficiency of expenditure, public expenditure, where some countries are doing a lot better than Spain. We still have a long way to go and learn from them. Now, the second important element that seems to really matter is debureaucratization. And you might think, well, obviously. Nobody wants a bureaucratic system. Well, that's not true. Every time something changes in Spain in public administration, we need somebody to sign a contract, an added step in the process. And talking to healthcare providers here in Spain, they tell me that their contracts are longer and longer every day. Bureaucratic administrations are very typical in Southern Europe, in France as well. So it seems that debureaucratizing human resources and procedures is important for better quality of government. In Spain, in order to try and avoid corruption, the idea is that there are many controls, for instance, for subsidies to given. And unfortunately, controls are often done not ex post, but ex ante, that is, before the subsidy has been granted. There's also an excess in Spain of bureaucratic selection process and recruitment process of civil servants compared to countries where bureaucracy is not very important and there's more mobility in the job market, where public administrations are more transparent and they're more similar in their procedures to companies in the public sector. Not having an excess of bureaucracy seems to be really important for the quality of government to be perceived as better. A bureaucratic system where there's no autonomy or freedom for people gets to extremes where, for instance, the director of a hospital might be recruited indirectly by a parliament. That's not right. The idea is that this is a control and protection against corruption, but that's not true. New Zealand, Sweden, those countries where there's more flexibility when it comes to recruiting civil servants, well, in fact, those are the countries where corruption is lower than other countries like Spain, for instance, where procedures are really heavy, very bureaucratic systems. So again, that correlation is not real. What models should we strive to get close to? Well, it would be the area there on the top right, New Zealand, Denmark, Finland, where there's less bureaucratization and more professionalism. And my opinion is that Spain has all the necessary ingredients to become more professional, at the same time as less bureaucratic, again, which are not contradictory terms. They're perfectly compatible. Now, one more change that would be required has to do with transparency, which has been really controversial during the COVID-19 pandemic. There were people who said, we have to be very careful with information, not to make people panic. And there's a Korean professor who has studied the Korean case during the pandemic, and this is one of his graphs. He says that a transparent policy right at the start means that there's a loss in trust because of the initial shock or concern. But over time, it's the transparent policy in a democratic regime that builds trust. So the message for politicians is that transparency does pay. And the final ingredient or element that I would like to mention is public-private partnerships, which again has been debated a lot during the pandemic. Public services and institutions are important, and because of that, some people are proposing that privatization should stop. We've seen in Europe over recent decades privatization of not just public services like nursing homes or care homes for older people. And then those people say we need care homes to be fully public, run by public servants, only public servants working for those services. In fact, there was a very serious, very interesting study in Sweden about care homes, and they found there was no impact on the death rate during the initial times of the COVID pandemic, comparing care homes that were run privately and those that were public, fully public. So that's why I think public-private partnerships are an important element, as long as they're smart, I call them, as long as they're well done. And I would like to mention a case study, a country, New Zealand, that we've read so much about. The proposal being that they've had the best management and response to the crisis. And in fact, I remember a statement where they said, well, don't forget that not everything was done right. And that we're an island, that helps. It's true that New Zealand did a lot in the recent past to control public expenditure, improve their management procedures, and President Ardern has done fantastically well. True, but I think the model in New Zealand is not just to do with politics, recent politics, but rather a result of all the good work done over the last few decades. And I think that's where we should learn some lessons from them. Back in the 1980s, New Zealand implemented a radical change in their policies, privatizing so many public services, railways, lots of different services. And then the Labour government there decided that the public sector should work after that radical change exactly like in the private market, with freedom and flexibility as well. As a result of that, there were scandals of companies that took advantage of that. There was cases of corruption, and thanks to Helen Clark, the brain that designed the success story in New Zealand. And she said one option was bureaucratizing again all the public services that had been outsourced in healthcare, education, and so on. Or the second option, which is the one that she selected, instead of eliminating competition, let's continue to have a competitive public sector, but let's build back capacity and internalize talent. Let's hire those people from the private sector that can do best for the public sector with good conditions, good contracts, people who will be there to filter and avoid abuse, and at the same time as equity is guaranteed. The so-called local government New Zealand 2003 model wanted to redress all the problems that outsourcing and privatization had caused, continue or go back to a good level of welfare, but getting the best from both worlds, from right-wing and left-wing politics, shall we say.
So there was a strong outsourcing of services, but also accompanied with a strong evaluation and internalisation of talent. This would perhaps be the formula that we can extract from this success story. And it's actually the complete opposite of what many administrations in Spain have been doing over recent years. They've been externalising talent. They just trust consultancy firms to design policies, but internalise routines. That's what they've been doing here in Spain. The work, the jobs inside the public administration are often routine, very, very routine tasks. And if you look at the different profiles for civil servants over recent years, all of these profiles have been for administrative staff, and we do need administrative staff, but we also need other profiles. We need people who are experts in STEM. We need other creative profiles, and they have been very absent from Spain over recent years, which means that, in fact, this is, I think, at the heart of these very mediocre results that we have achieved over recent years. And just to conclude, I would like to say that it is difficult to actually attract young talent to the civil service because they have to go through a very cumbersome process of public examinations, and they don't want it. They think it's just heavy, cumbersome, boring. And this is something that the public administration really needs to change. And it's not just something that's happened now, just after the pandemic. It was something that was prior to it as well. And public service, public sector is incapable of attracting young people. If you ask young people, what do you want to do if you want to make a difference in this world? Well, very, very few of them are going to say, oh, I'd like to be a public servant. Oh, I'd like to go into government, or I want to go into politics. They don't say that. They talk about other things and other sectors and other options. And it's not that the government is more important than these other options. Everything is necessary, but in fact, it's losing talent. Public administrations really do play a key role in ensuring citizens' well-being, but they are incapable of attracting talent, especially among the younger generations. Now, I don't want to finish this presentation with rather dim view, but it is the reality. And I think we need to recognise it in order to be able to change it. So thank you very much indeed for your attention. Thank you very much, Victor. Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. And now we have time for some questions. And we're going to try and be brief, because I'm sure your presentation has aroused a lot of interest, and we've got quite a lot of questions. Let's go with the first one. Is there good governance, good right-wing governance, good left-wing government? Is there a bias there? No, I don't think so. As I said before, the first thing is to measure the quality of governance. It doesn't matter whether it's a right-wing or left-wing program. And then, of course, it depends on how citizens respond to it. But I think that all political parties should be present in an administration that's practicing good governance. And I think that's the best way of increasing the quality of the government if we count on all political parties. Sorry, could you just face the public so that they can see you, and in fact we can hear you better in the microphone as well. Thank you very much. Another question that we have for you. Politicians, when we talk to them, they talk a lot about governance. and they say they're going to be committed to good governance, but that doesn't seem to have an impact on citizens. And if you had to perhaps make an X-ray of the, if you had to make an assessment, to carry out an assessment, what would you focus on? Well, I'd focus on citizens. We don't have good data. But I think that my indicator for the quality of governance would be asking citizens what they think. Citizens need to be asked, not both those who do participate and those who don't participate in the governance. Do the members of the community feel that the politicians are actually looking after their interests? The Etorkizuna Eraikiz initiative can be considered an institutional entrepreneurable initiative. Why is it so hard to maintain these initiatives over time? What will be the keys to success? There's a problem there. There's the traditional models of citizen engagement, I think, are coming to an end. They don't really work. But opening the doors to citizen participation also opens the door to those citizens who have more money, more higher education level, more time. They participate more. And often what happens is that this introduces a bias into the policies that are being enacted, because they're policies designed to suit the needs and interests of the wealthier section of society. So it's always a complicated dilemma. And I think we have to, it's a tightrope we have to walk, really. Participation is important, but it needs to be fair participation. It needs to be inclusive, and it's not going to actually prioritize any interests over any others. In the case of radical case that you talked about, recently in New Zealand, internalising talent and externalising services. How do you strike a balance between these two very different and opposite elements? Well, yes, this is what happened in New Zealand. And I can say really that it's just a constant process of experimentation, which is the same that we can say of Etorkizuna Eraikiz. It's just a policy laboratory that they try out to see what works and what doesn't, and not be arrogant and just think that I just work in academics and I know exactly what needs to be done. No, it's much more a case of kind of it's like a startup government, really. And it just creates itself, destroys itself, trial and error constantly, this constant feedback loop. God, this is really hard to sell to citizens. How can you say, hey, we're just going to govern you on the basis of trial and error? It doesn't go down very well. So we say we're going to experiment with, it's difficult. It's difficult to say that they're going to be, 2,000 employees that are going to maybe have access to basic income support, and another 2,000 that aren't, just to see what happens. Having a control group, an experimental group, it's difficult to sell that to citizens. And why are we going to work with some companies and not with others? But I think the idea is, or the way to go forward is to just go step by step. And trial and error, there are no magic recipes. Etorkizuna Eraikiz proposes a new way of doing politics. It involves a transformation of the organisation and the way the administration works. Do you agree with that statement? Yes, I think that we're seeing the repercussions of Etorkizuna Eraikiz on society. And in fact, it's important to analyse as well what sort of repercussions it's having on the institution itself, on the provincial government itself. I'm sure it will be having some effect on it. But the question is, how is it going to change? And how is it going to make the most of this? Do you know a good practice in the world somewhere that really has a specific appeal to young people? No, there aren't very many, to be honest. Now, talking about polarization, which is something I'm very interested in, I don't know if it's a public initiative, it's a private initiative, I think, but I think it could be scaled up to the public sector, and it's in the US. Often young people, well, everyone really, but especially young people, left-wingers and right-wingers don't talk to each other. For example, if you're on a dating app and you say you're a Republican, then there's no Democrat that's going to, like your profile on the dating app. They don't talk to each other, basically. And what occurring are third sector initiatives in universities and other places as well to actually put together people who think in a very different way, to force them to actually deliberate. It's like AA. It's like, but it's left wingers anonymous. Maybe we could call it right wingers anonymous. It's like politics anonymous. So it forces them to actually confront their adversary, to try to understand their point of view, and it's an exercise in understanding your political opponent. And as I said, this is a private initiative, but it could be scaled up to a public initiative. And I think this is a very important thing to do. And with the polarization that we have here on the Iberian Peninsula, I think this would be a good thing to do as well. Governance, does it entail risks? If it does, could you tell us about some of them? Yes, I think governance does entail risk of it being too much or being too little. If we make the public sector too big and we overstep, then it's just going to be very, very cumbersome. I think, as we can see on the private market, companies that don't work, they just get eliminated by the market. So the ones that are left are more competitive. And perhaps, I don't know, something similar should be applied to the public administration. Often, people in the public administration don't want to do things because they are afraid of the risks. And then there's also a risk of having too little governance. There are countries with a very, very strong state, but very, very little governance. And you can see that the result of that during the pandemic, they've had a higher death rate. Victor, the last question. There are many more, but we don't have time because your presentation really did excite a lot of interest. But this is the last question. Now, politicians, are they embracing governance because it's their only way out of the fact that politics now doesn't enjoy very much prestige? Well, I think politics and politicians are just embracing anything that seems like it works. That's true, because they understand themselves that what this current system isn't working. And if we look at all the different regimes in governance, in politics, in public institutions, hospitals, schools, etc., always needs to be critical. And we need to look at our politicians as CEOs of what would be a political company, and we should demand the same amount of efficiency from them. It's a difficult thing to do, but I think we need to really rethink institutions, and it's important to do that. And I think we should make the most of the pandemic because it offers us a wonderful opportunity to do that. Thank you very much. Victor Lapuente, thank you very much for being here. We've learned so much from you, and I hope to see you again very soon.